On a cold December night in 1979, Kabul was wrapped in an atmosphere of celebration. Inside the presidential palace, Hafizullah Amin dined with allies and high-ranking guests, convinced that victory was finally his. After months of battling religious uprisings, political rivals, and internal dissent, he believed he had secured decisive support from Moscow. According to Amin, Soviet divisions were already on their way, paratroopers had landed, and order would soon be restored. In his mind, the crisis was over. That confidence would prove fatal. What Amin did not realize, or perhaps refused to accept, was that the foreign forces crossing into Afghanistan were not coming to save him. By the next morning, the man who saw himself as the protector of the revolution would be dead. And with his fall, the Soviet Union would step into a war that would slowly drain its power, credibility, and future. The decision to intervene in Afghanistan was not sudden. It was the result of decades of geopolitical ambition, financial investment, and political miscalculation. For much of the Cold War, Afghanistan officially claimed neutrality, yet remained firmly within the Soviet sphere of influence. To Moscow, the mountainous, landlocked nation was strategically invaluable, a gateway toward the Middle East and South Asia. Millions of dollars flowed into Afghan infrastructure, military training, and diplomatic support. Afghan officers studied under Soviet supervision. Economic projects tied Kabul closely to Moscow, and from the Kremlin's perspective, the country was securely under control. But beneath this appearance of stability, resentment was quietly growing. Afghanistan's deeply religious and conservative population increasingly viewed foreign influence with suspicion and hostility. What appeared to be a reliable ally was, in reality, a pressure cooker on the verge of exploding. If this opening caught your attention, share your thoughts below and pass this story along to someone who enjoys raw, unfiltered history. Long before Soviet troops crossed the border, Afghanistan was already a nation pulled in opposing directions. While its leaders cultivated close ties with Moscow, the population remained deeply rooted in tradition, religion, and tribal identity. This disconnect created a fragile alliance, one that depended more on fear and force than genuine loyalty. Throughout the 1960s and early 1970s, the Kremlin watched Afghanistan carefully. Anti-communist protests, religious unrest, and nationalist movements appeared with increasing frequency. To Soviet planners, these incidents were warning signs that their influence could slip away. Still, they believed the situation could be managed through political pressure rather than open force. That calculation began to unravel in 1973, when Afghanistan's monarchy was overthrown in a bloodless coup. Mohammed Daoud Khan seized power, ending centuries of royal rule. At first, Moscow welcomed the change. Daoud had long-standing ties to the Soviets, and many assumed he would govern as a compliant partner, while Soviet-trained officers quietly held real authority behind the scenes. But Daoud refused to play that role. Once in power, he began distancing himself from communist ideology and reducing Soviet influence. He tightened his grip on the country, ruled as an increasingly authoritarian leader, and openly suppressed leftist groups. What the Kremlin expected to be a predictable client state was becoming dangerously independent. Tensions reached a breaking point in April 1978. After the murder of a prominent communist intellectual sparked mass demonstrations, Daoud responded with mass arrests. Communist leaders were imprisoned, and executions were planned. Facing elimination, the opposition chose to strike first. Within days, revolutionary forces stormed the presidential palace. After intense fighting, Daoud was killed, and a new communist government took control. While the exact role of the Soviet Union in the coup remains debated, one thing was certain. Moscow immediately recognized the new regime and hoped stability had finally been secured. Instead, the country plunged deeper into chaos. If this chapter added a new layer to the story, let others know what stood out to you and share it with someone who enjoys uncovering the roots of global conflicts. The new leadership promised transformation. Under Nur Muhammad Taraki, Afghanistan was to be reshaped from the ground up. The reforms were swift, radical, and deeply disconnected from the reality of Afghan society. Religion was pushed aside, traditional power structures were dismantled, and sweeping land reforms were imposed with little regard for local customs or tribal authority. Soviet advisors flooded into the country, embedding themselves in government offices, military units, and security services. From Kabul, the changes may have looked like progress. In the countryside, they felt like an attack on identity, faith, and survival. Resistance erupted almost immediately. Across villages and mountain valleys, conservative and religious communities took up arms. These groups were loosely organized at first, bound more by shared outrage than ideology. Over time, they became known collectively as the mujahideen, fighters who understood the land far better than any foreign-trained army ever could. Using rugged terrain and local support, they launched ambushes, sabotage operations, and hit-and-run attacks that steadily eroded government control. Instead of calming the country, Taraki's policies poured fuel on the fire. Arrests, executions, and forced compliance became routine. Entire regions slipped beyond government reach. What was meant to be a revolutionary reset turned into a nationwide rebellion. Then the revolution consumed its own leader. In a brutal internal power struggle, Taraki was assassinated by his deputy, Hafizullah Amin, the same man who would later claim unwavering loyalty to Moscow. Publicly, Amin pledged devotion to the Soviet Union and promised stability. Privately, Soviet intelligence viewed him as reckless, unpredictable, and possibly dangerous. Within weeks, discussions in Moscow shifted from influence to intervention. If this part changed how you see revolutions imposed from above, leave your take in the comments and share this story with someone who thinks history is never as simple as it seems. By the autumn of 1979, patience in the Kremlin had run out. Reports from advisors painted a grim picture. The Afghan government was losing control, desertions were rampant, and resistance forces were growing bolder by the day. Hafizullah Amin's assurances no longer carried weight. To Soviet leaders, he was no longer an asset, he was a liability. Inside Moscow's corridors of power, debate gave way to resolve. Some officials feared that direct military action would trap the Soviet Union in a long and costly conflict. Others, particularly within the intelligence services, argued that inaction was even more dangerous. They warned that Amin might turn toward the West, or that Afghanistan could collapse entirely, taking decades of Soviet investment with it. The final decision was swift and decisive. A plan was formed to remove Amin and replace him with a more reliable figure, one who would depend entirely on Soviet backing. To ensure success, the operation would rely not just on invading troops, but on deep infiltration. Soviet advisors were already embedded throughout the Afghan army. Elite units had secured key roads, airfields, and communication hubs. Even the Presidential Guard had been quietly penetrated by operatives in disguise. By mid-December, the order was signed. Tens of thousands of soldiers, armored vehicles, and tanks began moving toward the border. Officially, the intervention would be described as assistance to a friendly government. In reality, it was a carefully prepared takeover. The objective was simple: eliminate Amin, seize Kabul, and stabilize the country before the world could react. What Soviet planners underestimated was how quickly a limited operation could spiral into something far greater. If this moment felt like the point of no return, share your thoughts and pass this chapter along to someone who's fascinated by the hidden decisions that change history. On Christmas Eve, the operation moved from planning to action. Under the cover of darkness, Soviet forces began crossing into northern Afghanistan. At the same time, advisors inside Afghan military units quietly disrupted communications and delayed any coordinated response. By the time alarms sounded, it was already too late. 2 days later, the decisive strike began. Elite Soviet units, joined by select Afghan collaborators, advanced on the Tajbek Palace, Amin's heavily fortified residence overlooking Kabul. Earlier failed attempts to poison him had put the guards on high alert, and thousands of defenders surrounded the complex. Amin believed an attack was possible, but not from the very allies he trusted most. The assault was fast and merciless. Special forces stormed the palace from multiple directions, cutting through defenses with overwhelming firepower. Within less than an hour, the fight was over. Rooms were cleared one by one. Hafizullah Amin was killed inside his own stronghold, his rule ending in blood and confusion. That same night, a new leader was flown into the country under Soviet protection. By dawn, Kabul was effectively under foreign control. Hundreds of Afghan soldiers lay dead, thousands surrendered, and the capital fell silent under the presence of a new occupying force. What had been presented as support for a friendly government was now unmistakably an invasion. If this chapter shocked you, let others know what stood out and share it with someone who appreciates the raw turning points of history. With Kabul secured, the invasion accelerated. Soviet forces poured into Afghanistan along key land routes and air corridors, seizing major cities, military bases, and transportation hubs with remarkable speed. On paper, the operation looked like a success. Strategic targets were under control, a friendly government was installed, and resistance in urban centers appeared limited. But beyond the cities, a different reality unfolded. The Soviet army was trained for large-scale conventional warfare, not the brutal terrain of Afghanistan. In the mountains and rural valleys, mujahideen fighters melted into the landscape. They avoided direct confrontation, striking supply convoys, sabotaging infrastructure, and disappearing before Soviet units could respond. This created a dangerous pattern. Soviet troops held the cities and main roads, while vast stretches of the countryside remained firmly in rebel hands. Attempts to root out resistance often ended in frustration, as guerrilla fighters exploited caves, high ground, and local support networks. Every cleared village risked being retaken the moment troops withdrew. Compounding the problem was the weakness of the Afghan government's own forces. Desertions were common, loyalty was questionable, and entire units sometimes mutinied. Instead of sharing the burden, Soviet troops found themselves fighting alone in an unfamiliar land. What was meant to be a short intervention was quietly turning into an open-ended occupation. If this shift in momentum surprised you, share your perspective and pass this story along to someone who's interested in how wars evolve far beyond their original plans. As the fighting dragged on, the conflict could no longer be contained within Afghanistan's borders. Images of foreign troops, burning villages, and fleeing civilians spread across the globe. What had begun as a regional intervention quickly became an international crisis. Condemnation came fast. Most of the world openly rejected the invasion. Diplomatic pressure mounted, economic consequences followed, and the Soviet Union found itself increasingly isolated. Trade restrictions were imposed, major agreements were frozen, and symbolic gestures, including global boycotts, sent a clear message that Moscow stood alone on the world stage. But opposition was not limited to words. Behind the scenes, support for the Afghan resistance expanded rapidly. Weapons, funding, and training flowed in from multiple countries. Neighboring states became logistical lifelines, offering safe passage, supply routes, and bases of operation. What had once been loosely connected rebel groups were becoming better armed, better organized, and far more dangerous. The balance of power slowly began to shift. New weapons challenged Soviet air superiority, making helicopter gunships and attack aircraft increasingly vulnerable. Supply lines were attacked relentlessly, especially in narrow mountain passes where convoys had nowhere to escape. Each loss chipped away at the perception of Soviet invincibility. For the first time in decades, a global superpower appeared trapped, not by another state, but by fighters who refused to disappear. If this global turning point changed how you view the conflict, let your voice be heard and share this part with someone who follows the unseen forces shaping world events. By the early 1980s, the war had settled into a grim routine. Soviet forces focused on defending what they already held rather than expanding control. Major cities and supply routes were heavily guarded, while vast rural regions remained beyond reach. The promise of stability had long vanished. The human cost was staggering. Protests erupted in urban centers and were crushed with force. Demonstrations were met with mass arrests, violence, and fear. Entire communities were punished for suspected cooperation with resistance fighters. In the countryside, airstrikes and raids devastated villages, pushing millions of civilians to flee their homes. At the same time, resistance forces escalated their own brutal tactics. Torture, executions, and reprisals became common. Civilians were trapped between two sides, each demanding loyalty and offering none in return. By the middle of the decade, millions had fled the country, creating one of the largest refugee crises of the Cold War. Despite the suffering, the war showed no sign of ending. Every new offensive failed to deliver a decisive blow. Supply lines were constantly threatened, especially in strategically vital valleys where local commanders knew every path and hiding place. Years of fighting produced exhaustion, not victory. Inside the Soviet Union, doubts began to surface. Veterans returned with stories that contradicted official narratives. Families questioned the purpose of a war that seemed impossible to win. If this chapter made the human cost feel real, share your thoughts and pass this story along to someone who believes wars are measured only in battles, not in lives. By the mid-1980s, it was becoming impossible to deny the truth. The war was draining resources, morale, and credibility at an alarming rate. What had been envisioned as a controlled intervention had turned into a grinding conflict with no clear victory in sight. Inside the Soviet leadership, a new question began to dominate every discussion: how to leave without admitting defeat. When new leadership emerged in Moscow, the tone shifted. The war was no longer framed as a mission to win, but as a problem to contain and eventually escape. The strategy changed from expansion to stabilization. Soviet forces reduced their direct combat role while attempting to strengthen the Afghan government enough to survive on its own. Leadership in Kabul was reshuffled. A new figure was placed at the head of the state, tasked with repairing a fractured nation. Political prisoners were released, religious identity was cautiously reintroduced into public life, and limited political reforms were announced. These gestures aimed to heal divisions, but decades of distrust could not be erased overnight. Resistance groups remained unconvinced, and fighting continued. Meanwhile, Soviet troops slowly pulled back from the front lines. Afghan forces expanded in number, but desertion rates remained high, and battlefield performance failed to improve. Each attempted offensive ended the same way, with no lasting gains and mounting casualties. The war had entered its final phase, not with a decisive blow, but with quiet resignation. If this turning point stood out to you, add your perspective and share this chapter with someone who's interested in how empires struggle to retreat. The final withdrawal began without victory parades or celebration. Over the course of months, Soviet troops crossed back over the border in carefully planned stages. For the most part, the departure was quiet, negotiated, and deliberate. The goal was no longer triumph. It was survival and dignity. When the last soldiers left, the war was officially over for the Soviet Union, but for Afghanistan, it was only the beginning of a far darker chapter. The government left behind struggled to maintain control. Without foreign troops, old rivalries resurfaced almost immediately. Former allies turned on one another, and the resistance fractured into competing factions. The battlefield shifted from occupation to civil war as power vacuums spread across the country. The long-term consequences were devastating. Millions were dead or displaced. Entire generations grew up knowing only conflict. Institutions collapsed, extremism flourished, and instability became the norm rather than the exception. What started as a geopolitical calculation during the Cold War reshaped Afghanistan's future in ways no one fully anticipated. For the Soviet Union, the cost was equally profound. The war shattered the myth of military invincibility, fueled internal dissent, and weakened the political system from within. Within a few short years, the state itself would cease to exist. History rarely ends when armies leave. Sometimes that is when the damage truly reveals itself. If this conclusion made you reflect on how wars echo long after the fighting stops, share your thoughts and pass this story along to keep these lessons alive.